A number of years ago, the English orchestral conductor Thomas Beecham quipped, "The English may not like music, but they absolutely love the noise it makes." I don't know if Beecham ever explained what he meant, but I think I know what he meant. I think that there's an assumption there that music should be recognized as something more than pleasant noise, and that those who regard it just as pleasant noise aren't really liking it as music. Last night, I referred to Douglas Adams's Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency and read a passage in which his character, Richard Macduff, has an encounter with music that feels like an epiphany, a revelation of the transcendent. And he says, maybe I should be religious. In the book, there's another character named Michael Wenton Weeks. And the last name, Wenton Weeks, it sounds kind of wimpy, right? He's the editor of an arts magazine, and he, at the beginning of one chapter, is experiencing a powerful sense of ennui and boredom. And he walks into his workroom and he finds an old record of some Vivaldi wind concertos. And he puts it on his ancient record player. And this is how Douglas Adams describes the experience that Mr. Wenton Weeks has. Suddenly, he found to his surprise that he was actually listening to the music. A bewildered look crept slowly across his face as he realized that he had never done this before. He had certainly heard it many, many times and thought that it made a very pleasant noise. Indeed, he found that it made a pleasant noise, a background noise, against which to discuss the concert season. But it had never actually occurred to him that there was anything actually to listen to. He sat thunderstruck by the interplay of melody and counterpoint, which suddenly stood revealed to him with a clarity that owed nothing to the dust-ridden surface of the record or the 14-year-old stylus. Many of you won't know what a stylus is. Have your grandparents explain to you what a stylus is. But with this revelation came an almost immediate sense of disappointment, which confused him all the more. The music suddenly revealed to him was oddly unfulfilling. It was as if his capacity to understand the music had suddenly increased up to and far beyond the music's ability to satisfy it, all in one dramatic moment. He strained to listen for what was missing and felt that the music was like a flightless bird that didn't even know what capacity it had lost. It walked very well, but it walked where it should soar. It walked where it should swoop. It walked where it should climb and bank and dive. It walked where it should thrill with the giddiness of flight. It never even looked up. This poor man, this editor of an arts magazine, organizing a concert series, hearing music but not listening to it, he suddenly realized when he was able to listen, and how he suddenly acquires this capacity is part of the mystery of the story. He suddenly realizes there's not as much to listen to as one could hope for. And this is a realization in the book that establishes an expectation for music that does soar and bank and dive, music that has a kind of revelatory quality like the music that later in the book Richard Macduff hears. One of the side effects of becoming more attentive to musical meaning is that we become less satisfied with many common musical expressions. And there is good, objective, scientifically demonstrated reason to feel dissatisfied at much of the music that we hear. Last July, a group from the Spanish National Research Council, some of them from the field of artificial intelligence, some from mathematics, published a report in the journal Scientific Reports. It's a wonderful, kind of authoritative name. The report documented the findings from research in which the researchers examined the musical structure of 464,411 Western popular music recordings released between 1955 and 2010. It included pop, rock, hip-hop, folk, and funk. And what they found, having figured out a way to analyze the melodic and harmonic structure and other aspects of the music using computers to make all sorts of quantitative calculations, they found that the melodies in popular music were gradually getting less and less complex. There was less and less there to listen to melodically. They also found that the sound quality was getting more and more homogeneous and predictable. Things sounded more and more alike, scientifically. And they also found that the music was getting louder and louder over time. So your parents were right, it turns out. The distinctively musical elements were becoming less interesting. There's a little bit in the research about harmonic complexity also. The distinctive music elements were getting less interesting, more predictable, while the purely sonic power of the music was getting stronger. It made a stronger sensory impression, but a weakened aesthetic impression. When I read this, I was reminded of a warning in C.S. Lewis's essay, Learning in Wartime, in which he says that we need good culture because we don't live with no culture. We always have either better culture or worse culture. And he says if you don't go on thinking rationally, you will think irrationally. And if you reject aesthetic satisfactions, you will fall into sensual satisfactions. So we trade off aesthetic richness that requires attentiveness, that we actually listen and feel how the melody works, how the harmonic progressions happen. We give that up and we get something louder, which occupies our bodies, but not our minds. In the first letter of the Corinthians, in the context of discussing worship and speaking in tongues, St. Paul asserts, I will sing with the Spirit and I will sing with the understanding also. That's the King James Version. The ESV, I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. It's one of my favorite verses. It's on the music page on our church's website. And the word translated here, understanding or mind, nous, it's the same word St. Paul uses in Romans 12:2, in which he urges believers to resist conformity to the world by having their minds transformed. Now, it's helpful to remember, and this is very important, because we read this as modern people, and we think of mind as being, again, a kind of organ for sheer rational calculation. But when Paul uses the word mind, and particularly that word nous, I think it's not just an organ of analytic reason. It's not just a calculating machine. The view of mind that Paul is working with encompassed a lot more than our modern connotation of the word suggests, and it tended to include imagination and intuition, which are mental activities also. So I think that in Romans 12, the call to have our minds transformed doesn't just refer to our explicit ideas, the product of analytic reason, but to have everything that involves our minds transformed, including our intuitions and imaginations and the deep assumptions about reality that we carry and that are conveyed to us in artistic expression through what Jacques Maritain called creative intuition. We see these different sides of the mind present in Latin when the words intellectus, from which we get intellectual, and ratio, from which we get rational, are distinguished. And they were clearly distinguished as different but complementary mental capacities. Aquinas describes intellect as a kind of simple, immediate grasp of a truth, whereas reasoning, ratio, is the product of the progression towards a truth by going from one point to another. Ratio, even the word ratio survives in mathematics. It suggests a more analytic process. But intellectus, the intellectual life, is one whereby we grasp something almost immediately. C.S. Lewis has a helpful discussion of the distinction in his book, The Discarded Image, his discussion of the medieval worldview. And he writes there, we are enjoying intellectus when we just see a truth as self-evident. We're exercising ratio when we proceed step by step expect to prove a truth which is not self-evident. And the reason I want to introduce this distinction is mainly to say that the mind involves both of these things. We tend to think that the mind involves just that reasoning process. And so when we talk about music and say, if I say that some music is more intelligent than other music, as I made the mistake of saying to a PCA pastor after I was in his worship service and he asked me what I thought of it, and the lunchtime conversation was over the question of whether or not we could even use the word intelligent to describe music. Well, I'm using intelligent to speak of intellectus, something that involved intuition and imagination being refined and developed, not just something that was capable of being reduced to a syllogism in a logical argument. Intuitive and imaginative skills can be cultivated. If we want our kids to think well, we make them learn logic and to learn formal fallacies and informal fallacies. We don't give as much attention to helping them imagine well or intuit well, but the imagination can certainly be cultivated through experience and training as well. To move it out of the realm of music, someone who has gardened for years can have an intellectual approach to gardening. That is, they can just see a plant and recognize what's wrong with it. They don't have to go through a conscious process of reasoning. They can recognize almost intuitively how why a garden might be suffering. The mind is more than a computer. So to sing with the mind, and here I'll grant that Paul does have texts in mind in that context. He's not eliminating texts, and I'll cover that in a minute. To sing with the mind means that the experience of music is more than just pleasant noise. It's more than just something that sounds nice. So St. Paul's singing with his mind and the singing of the church with him can be an intelligible act, an act that appeals to the understanding and not just the feelings or the inward disposition. Now again, we tend to separate the two. We say, well, the words will appeal to the ratio, and the music appeals not even to intellectus, but the music just appeals to feelings directly. It bypasses the mind. And it appeals often to the body. The reason there are subwoofers is because we want music that will assault us bodily, but not as music, as a sonic experience. It's like the canon in the 1812 overture. The difference is they don't fire cannon perpetually throughout. It's used as an accent device, not as kind of the mainstay of things. So I'm not opposed to the body being assaulted in that way musically. It's just that it's not the whole of musical experience. I think, as I said, Paul clearly meant that we should pay attention to the words when we sing, when we worship God. But the musical form is also capable of being intelligible. The musical form actually is conveying some kind of content to us, whether or not we're paying attention to it. Music is intelligible, but not all music is intelligent. People who sing with their minds and are paying attention to the text and the music will have a hard time overcoming the cognitive dissonance if the text that they're singing is very intelligent and the music that they're singing is very stupid. Some of us find it hard to attend to and receive the significance of the words when the music is not very intelligent. We really want to sing with our minds, but they're not letting us. We want to be fully engaged in the text, not in the analytic way, but because we want our emotions to be fully engaged with the joy of the text also. But we're distracted, some of us, because the triteness or the inappropriateness, the unfittingness of the text, to sing Amazing Grace to a tango or something, as it comes to mind immediately. Music has a unique capacity to involve the spirit and the body and the emotions and the mind, and whenever we eliminate or neglect the involvement of any of these, we diminish the gift that music is. Just a few more words about music and worship, but I really like not to focus on that because I think we need to understand music before we talk about music and worship. If our experience of music is only at the level of physical sensation and emotional stimulation, if that's typically the case Monday through Saturday, if that's the only way we've used music all week, and then we come to church and we bring that pattern of musical experience with us into worship, then I think we're effectively approaching God as a mere dispenser of therapeutic comfort. And I do think there is a reason why the therapeutic twist of the gospel has accompanied music that is unintelligent, music that doesn't strive to be the kind of intellectual, and here I don't mean something fancy, I mean the tune we just sang has a wonderful intelligibility about it, and it's based on a folk melody. But I do think there's a link between the move toward a therapeutic understanding of who God is and what redemption is about, and music that essentially serves as a kind of either stimulant or sedative, as a kind of either noise that excites us or noise that calms us down, and nothing more than that. Now, God, of course, is a comforter. That's the title given in Scripture to God, the Holy Spirit. But God, the Son, is the Logos. He's the word or ordering principle of creation. God is not just a comforter. God is the one in whom, and Christ particularly, is the one in whom all things have their being and their meaning. So Christ is the source of intelligibility, the creator of a universe in which there is evident intelligibility. Now, as I've argued the first two lectures, for centuries, music in the West was assumed to be something that one could apprehend with one's mind as well as with one's emotions, because the creation was both beautiful and intelligible, because God is both beauty and logos. Theologian David Schindler refers to Christ as the Logos who is love. It's a phrase I really like. Music uniquely combines the experience of delight through the senses and experienced intelligibility. We experience the order of music in our bodies. When you sing a well-constructed melody or sing in harmony in a thoughtful musical work, you're experiencing the beautiful intelligibility from the inside. It inhabits you and you inhabit it in some way. But if music is composed or performed in a way that obscures either beauty or intelligibility, if music is experienced only as a sheer appeal to or assault on our senses, then we become participants in the denial or the fracturing of that combination of love and order, of beauty and reason that is at the heart of creation. This is why I can't worship in some settings, because I'm actually being asked to participate in the denial of a very important central truth about creation, a coupling that's at the heart of creation, and it's there because it's in the very nature of the one by whom and through whom and for whom all things were made, and in whom all things hold together, and in whom all things find their coherence and their loveliness and their rationality. Our commitment to keeping love and order, beauty and reason together should raise questions about our modern tendency to separate form and content, which is something I said I would ruthlessly assault, and I will proceed to do so. Music is a wonderful rebuke to that assumption. Even music that doesn't work the way people think it should work often unwittingly shows how form and content are related. When people insist that form and content are separable and that for Christians content is what really matters and form doesn't really matter at all, they're giving voice to a kind of dualism that insists that the material and the spiritual really don't interpenetrate one another in any way, that body and mind are linked only out of necessity, that the world as perceived by the senses is not the same thing as the world as described by the mind, that the senses aren't reliable to engage us with reality, and hence that reason and imagination are entirely different human activities. This wall, once you create that wall between form and content, it's a big wall, and it cultivates many other things. This is also why art education is so poorly supported in our culture, and science education is heavily supported. Now, there are many thinkers, including many people who are writing about the arts, who've challenged this dualism. Those of you interested in the visual arts may be familiar with some seminal writing by a psychologist named Rudolf Arnheim, who in a book called Art and Visual Perception, and I'll leave that there for a moment, I'll come back to it later if you want, more profoundly in a book of his called Visual Thinking, argued that artistic activity is a form of reasoning. It is an intellectual activity. Another way so I'm saying that music, our experience of music should really challenge that wall of dualism. Now another way, oh no, it's supposed to be black. I've got it, yeah, I blacked it out. That's an intentional. Well, maybe oh, it's not on at all? So you've not seen any of the things I've shown here? I just realized that. Oh, really? Oh, I had a wonderful time. It meant a lot to me. Can we? I might have gone into standby, or did it go? I thought it was on when I came up here. No. While we're fixing that, let me. We have a little bit of time, but I hope it works because I have some wonderful visual aids, and it's better than me trying to mime what I'm trying to say. Did we lose a bulb? Oh boy. One way to break down this wall, I'll have to regroup here, has been to observe how all language and hence all reasoning relies on the use of metaphors. And so all language involves appeals to knowledge gained by sense experience. The universal use in computers of graphic interfaces is an example of how we naturally think about, we even think about information in using visual metaphors. But despite all the arguments and demonstrations that have challenged the solidity of the wall between form and content, there are still many people, including many Christian people, who still insist that form and content are not only separable, but that form is meaningless. And here, I'd like you to imagine a slide. Oh, really? Oh, well, I hope that's it. Joy. Let me narrate the slide for the visually impaired. Rick Warren, quote, "Music is nothing more than an arrangement of notes and rhythms. It's the words that make a song spiritual." Good, we're coming up. I'm so happy. Music is nothing more than an arrangement of notes and rhythms. It's the words that make a song spiritual. I came across that quote by Rick Warren in one of his purpose books. And I was reminded of a passage in C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in which a very important distinction is made between what something is and what something happens to be made of. Music is nothing more than an arrangement of notes and rhythms. It's the words that make a song spiritual. You may remember the scene when that very bratty character, Eustace, who, when I read the book to the kids, couldn't avoid reading his part without a nasally voice. Eustace has to have adenoid issues, I'm sure. Eustace is talking with Ramandu, a being who claimed to be a star in human form. And Eustace can't cope with this claim. Eustace says, "In our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas." To which Ramandu responds, and here speaking for C.S. Lewis, "Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of." Music is made of notes and rhythms and other things, but that to say that's all that music is a kind of category mistake. I'm so happy this is coming because the important parts are coming. Imagine a slide in which Rick Warren's claim that music is nothing more than an arrangement of notes and rhythms, and George Steiner, the magisterial literary critic, who talks about how music is necessarily meaningful. And I hope we can. Are we back into the world? Okay. Oops. Almost. Okay. So here's what you missed. Okay, all these walls. And then here was Rudolf Arnheim, and we'll go past Rudolf Arnheim. And here is Rick Warren. And here is Ramandu. Okay. Now, here is Rick Warren in one corner of the ring, and George Steiner in the other corner of the ring. Music is brimful of meanings which will not be translated into logical structures or verbal expression. Much better than I remembered. Brimful of meanings, but they're not things we can reduce to words. And this is one of the reasons why Christians get nervous. Some Christians get nervous but talk about music as meaning. If it's meaningful, you ought to be able to reduce it to words. But no, Steiner's saying, and here I'm siding with Mr. Steiner, in music, form is content and content is form. But that's not just true in music. It's true in every art form. It's true in architecture, in novels, in dance, in poetry, in film, and painting. It's true in magazine layout. It's true in industrial design, in the choice of fonts. It's true in facial gestures, in manners of walking, in styles of dress, in ways of touching another person, and on and on and on. When you start to think about it, it turns out that most of the communication that we perceive, most of the knowledge that we have about the world and things in it, come from nonverbal, non-propositional communication that can't be entirely exhaustively reduced to words, reduced to logical structures. But are still present and meaningful in the form of things. Now, in many Christian circles, discussion of the meaningfulness of form, including musical form, is virtually prohibited, and forms are usually discussed in terms of popularity, not of suitability or adequacy to particular tasks. Forms are treated as meaningless vehicles for the content of conceptual knowledge, or they're regarded as motivational devices, and usually carrots rather than sticks, that are employed to stimulate enthusiasm about certain truth claims or certain moral commitments. You know, it's a little bit like saying we want to get people serious about nutrition. Let's give them a dozen donuts to get them serious about nutrition. To say that the only kind of knowledge Christians should be concerned with is conceptual knowledge is to treat human beings like computers, brains with no bodies, no loves, and no qualities. Another way of objecting to this confusion is to observe that meaning is bigger than verbal content. Flowers left by a bedside in a hospital are meaningful. A cross burned in someone's front yard is meaningful. A child running to greet her father returning home means something different from a child sitting coolly on a porch step until he arrives. Eye contact, or the lack of it, is meaningful. The presence of a friend means something different from a text message, especially if you're in a hospital bed. A gift carefully wrapped and hand-delivered means something different from a gift card left anonymously on your desk. Words, rationally perceived, are necessary for stating and defending truth, and we as Christians care about truth, but we care about more than truth. We care about realities that can only be partially described by words. We care about joy and sorrow, about hope and frustration, about fidelity and fear, about love and justice. And all of these abstractions are known by us as embodied creatures living in space and time. Sorrow and fear or hope aren't abstractions when you experience them, and what you experience can only be partially put into words. And many works of art, forms of imaginative expression, are suited better than analytic language of expressing what living through and within such realities means. Now, the meanings of the realities with which we're concerned, which is pretty much all of human experience, can't be exhaustively described through declarations and definitions and argument, and clearly God knows this better than we do, which is why when God reveals himself to us, reveals who he is, what he's doing in the world, he does so in concrete realities of creation. First in the heavens and the mountains and the seas and ants and in trees and in marriage. as well as in inspired stories and poetry with metaphors and imagery, parables and hymns, letters and visions. The Bible doesn't arrive as systematic theology, nor is the Bible given us just to create jobs for systematic theologians, who, once they complete their work, can get rid of all the imagery and the messiness and the fuzziness of the Bible. The Bible is given in forms that are to form our lives, and it does so in part by capturing our imagination as well as engaging our analytic reason. And in fact, our imagination has to be involved before reason can even do its work. Now, if all these claims I'm making, that we can never be indifferent to forms. We can't treat forms as just a disposable package, paper or plastic. The medium is the message. The forms our lives take say more than the words we speak. And likewise, the forms we use to communicate to others often says more than the words do. Or they can say something other than what our words do. Saying, "I really care about you," while looking at your watch is not entirely convincing. So the forms of bodily expression have to fit the words that we speak. Now, works of music have meaning, and because that, thoughtful musicians and composers pay attention to the fittingness of their work. Someone composing a work to commemorate a momentous public event would try to capture a sense of the grandeur or gravity. A pianist at an elegant night spot doesn't play John Philip Sousa marches. A football coach preparing his team for the big game is not likely to treat the locker room to one of Eric Satie's haunting and ambiguous pieces for solo piano. Mothers soothing a troubled child don't play the final allegro from the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony. Despite the confidence that music is just notes and rhythms without meaning, and get ready, Gresham, until words, that they're just notes and rhythms until the words are added, as Pastor Warren thinks, most people do have a sense that some words fit with some songs better than others. And that's an assumption behind a very funny feature that's been part of a long-running weekly comedy program on the BBC that I've listened to quite a bit called I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, which is kind of a spoof of BBC game shows. And on that program, panelists, all of whom are stand-up comics, are asked to sing the lyrics of one song to the tune of another song, with results that delight the live audience and as well as those of us listening at home. Some of my favorites were the rendition of the lyrics of Procol Harum's A Whiter Shade of Pale to the theme song of the Muppets. I'll let you imagine that for a moment, those of you who remember Procol Harum, old enough, gray enough to remember Procol Harum. The lyrics of Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting to the tune of Scarborough Fair. And Eric Clapton's Cocaine sung to the tune of The White Cliffs of Dover. Lest you have a faulty imagination, we're going to hear a couple of these. The first in which, well, I'll let Humphrey Littleton, the host of the show, invite the person, the first one. Gresham. We ready?
Okay, Graham, would you sing the words of the theme to the Flintstones to the tune of My Way?
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're the modern Stone Age family. Let's ride with the family down the street through the courtesy of Fred's 2 feet. When you're with the Flintstones, have a yabba dabba gay old time. When you're with the Flintstones, have a yabba dabba do time. A yabba do time. You'll have a gay old time.
let's hear another. Just to make my point.
You now, Tony, would you please sing the words of Girlfriend in a Coma by the Smiths to the tune of Tiptoe Through the Tulips?
Girlfriend in a coma, I know that it's serious. So girlfriend in a coma, I know it's really serious. There were times when I could have murdered her, but I would hate anything to happen to her. Do you really think she'll pull through? Think she'll pull through? Oh, girlfriend, yes, it's serious. My baby, goodbye.
Okay, now everybody thinks that's funny. So why, when I go to certain worship services and a similar incongruity is evident, do people think... And I assert this, people think I'm just Grandpa Simpson? I mean, there's an incongruity here. If you want, there are lots of these I was glad to find on YouTube. In fact, I'd been listening to this show as a podcast for years. Or not a podcast, just I've been listening to streaming audio. The show is called I'm Sorry, I Haven't a Clue, and you can search and you can do this at home. One song to the tune of another is the feature, and there are many others that are quite remarkable. Now, of course, these performances demonstrate how forms convey meaning that makes them fitting for some settings and not for others, and that presupposes that forms are meaningful. Not that they can be translated into sentences, but that they convey a mood, they convey a kind of adverb or an adjective, or if not a noun or a verb or a feeling, and they make you want to move your body in certain ways. The rhythm of that jaunty tiptoe through the tulips, it's hard not to do this, and not just because we've seen people in videos do it, it's just the way the rhythm works on our bodies. And it's not the appropriate sentiment to go to the hospital and ask, do you really think she'll pull through this way, okay? Now, some people say it's purely conventional. We've learned to associate certain ideas or feelings with certain forms, but that's not likely. Let me give some evidence to the contrary. Look at these two images. These are famous in psychological research. First, in 1929, psychologist Wolfgang Köhler conducted research on the island of Tenerife. I don't even know where Tenerife is, but the Spanish is the native language. And he showed forms very similar to these and asked participants which shape was named Takate and which shape is named Baluba. And he found that there was a really strong preference. And who can guess which one is Takata? The one on the left, everybody thinks that's Takata. And Baluba is the, nonsense syllables, but for some reason, we associate with a long, round vowel, luba, baluba, and Takata, the percussiveness of those consonants suggests something edgy and angular. There's nothing logical about that. There's no reason except something in the nature of personal experience that makes that almost universally perceived. In 2002, researchers repeated this. 2001, researchers repeated this, and they used simpler words because we're not as smart as people were in 1929. They just used the word kiki and booba. And they surveyed American college undergraduates, and they went to India to Tamil, people who spoke the language Tamil, which is very unlike English, and they found that there was a 95 to 98% linkage, that Kiki is the one on the right and Buba is the one, Kiki the one on the left and Buba the one on the right. And research has shown that this effect is evident. Kids as young as 2.5 have already somehow begin to sense that that's the case. Now, here are two other shapes I want you to look at. And this is a little experiment that I actually picked up from Nick Waltersdorf's book, Art in Action. I'll put up a slide in a minute. Now, if I was to ask you which line you would associate with the color yellow and which with the color purple, which one is yellow and which one is purple? Yellow is top and purple is bottom. Most people feel that way. If I was to ask you which line was more like basketball and which was like baseball, there would probably be a lot of agreement. Because there's a metaphoric likeness. Even though these are just lines, there's no real world thing except through the mediation of our experience and embodied experience. And it turns out that these are cross-cultural. When these likenesses are researched, it turns out that no matter what kind of language you speak, no matter what kind of belief system's in place, no matter what the weather's like where you grew up, that these kinds of acoustic sounds, but not just acoustic sounds, but how certain abstract forms become associated with certain kinds of activities that have a certain kind of quality. In his book, Art in Action, Waltersdorf discusses the idea of fittingness and how artists always have to work with fittingness both for the subject matter and for the materials that they're working with. And it shows that there's a lot of remarkable cross-cultural agreement. He describes a parlor game in which people take the word ping and the word pong, and they come up with lists that are associated with ping and pong. And here's Nick's own list from the book. If you had to associate the word light, or the group of light and heavy with ping or pong, most people associate ping with light. Again, we feel that vowels like I are light and O are heavy. Small and large, ice cream, warm pea soup. Mozart's music, Beethoven's music. I came up with my own list just for fun a couple of years ago. Little strange. Now again, it's not 100% universal, but it turns out that there is a kind of association that does occur. We perceive the meaning of forms by recognizing some kind of likeness between the form and other things in our experience. Bright vowels in speech, E's and I's, have a different quality than what we call the darker sounds or rounder sounds, O and Oo. And why do we call them bright or dark or round? When we say E, your face does one thing. When you say O, it does some other thing. That may be part of the clue. Forms are meaningful because we live our lives in the form of our bodies. When we're burdened, we bend. When we express deference, we lower our heads and our eyes. When we're excited, our hearts rate at a faster rhythm. When we strive to be attentive or when we're pensive, we slow down, sometimes to stillness. And composers and performers who are attentive to the meaning of forms are deliberate in their choice of such things. Different musical forms represent various aspects of reality. Music conveys aspects of reality. It enables us not just to apprehend, but to participate to some degree in those aspects of reality. Some forms express the idea of majestic greatness, and in performing or listening, we're indwelt with a sense of the experience of greatness. Some forms express the idea of humility and reticence. Some convey grief or restlessness or anticipation or fulfillment. And our response is not totally subjective or arbitrary. I don't think anyone would listen to, for example, the Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and say it was music about melancholy longing. Or you wouldn't play Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind to try to incite people to really active competitive behavior. It's the structure of the music in use of melody and harmony and rhythm that enable music to achieve its effects. Architect and designer Christopher Alexander is very interested in form in the designing of buildings and organizing of public places. And he's written quite a bit about these matters. He's designed a test to train people to be more deliberate in their perception of beauty. And he has groups of people choose two objects at random, and then one by one he interviews each member of the group and asks them privately a number of questions. He first says, which of these two objects is the more attractive? Which do you like best? Why do you like it? which gives you the most wholesome feeling? We have power. Which of them better represents your whole self? If you had a choice, which would you spend eternity with? We're kind of raising the bar a little bit. Which of them would you be happier to offer to God? And what he's found in the last three evoke a much deeper response. The more serious questions evoke much more unanimity from the students he tests. In the last three, there's a 90% agreement on which object they'd rather present to God, whereas the first three are almost randomly distributed. It's kind of, half and half. The first three are much, much more subjective. When it gets down to things that really matter, it turns out that people do tend to agree. Again, even on choice of randomly, it could be a shoe and that banner or something. Well, that banner may not be a good thing because God's involved in the banner. A couple of years ago, I had dinner with a seminary professor who knows a lot about music, and we were talking about this problem of music illiteracy. And he remarked how frustrating it was when he was invited to have a meal with students in their apartments, and he saw these very thoughtful books on their shelves and very intelligent art on the walls. And then he said, and then I look at their CD collection. Nothing but songs, 3.5-minute songs. And he was lamenting the absence of habits of intelligent listening only to short and often monotonous songs, which means that we don't have to cultivate an awareness of how music might achieve meaningful development in time. People do tend to listen to music in the background as a kind of ambient presence, not something that takes shape through time, something that develops and that we can attend to over time. So music, but music, we need to remember, music achieves its meaning in time. It becomes what it is because we've sat through it and listened to it over time. And we remember something that happened earlier when we hear something that happened later. And the something that happened later is different because of the thing we heard that happened earlier. Music, in a sense, confers meaning on time. I think it helps us understand something of the nature of temporality. But if we treat music just as something that is in the background, we really can't perceive this. I'm going to skip part of this so we can play another musical example. Oh, no, I don't do that now. Anyway, that's good. I want to recommend, I already mentioned Julian Johnson's book, Who Needs Classical Music? I want to recommend another book that does talk about music, although music is not its principal focus. John McWhorter's book called Doing Our Own Thing, which has my favorite subtitle of all time, The Degradation of Language and Music and Why We Should Like Care. McWhorter is a linguist, and his principal argument in this book, the degradation that he has in mind, is the loss of the possibility of formal speech, of oratory, of rhetorically rich, of elegant speech. And he argues that we may be the first culture in human history that has really lost the capacity for formality in speech. And he compares, for instance, he compares speeches given after 9/11 with speeches given after Pearl Harbor. He says in the introduction that, in reference to George W. Bush's speech where he quoted Todd Beamer at the end and said, "Let's roll." He said if Abraham Lincoln had ever ended a speech saying, "Let's roll," he would have been assassinated years earlier. McWhorter is not a dull pedant, as you might see. Now, why are we suspicious of eloquence? Why are we suspicious of things that are formal and eloquent and elegant? And he maintains that this is largely due to our suspicion of authority, which really triumphed in the mid-1960s. And he argues that the real cultural triumph of the 60s was the triumph of the casual. And that means that any kind of demanding form in language or in music, anything that really requires attentiveness and care and thoughtfulness and submission to a kind of formal set of requirements, it's contrived, it's inauthentic, it's uncool, It's not something we like. But it's the thing I want you to remember, it's all about suspicion of authority. It's not just something that changed that is morally irrelevant. And he says this happened in almost all aspects of our experience, in our clothing, in dance, in food, in artistic and linguistic activities. Formality suggests that higher standards should rule, and that requires tutelage and efforts to master, and we don't like authority. Now, most of the book is about language, as I said, but he does have a chapter on music. He's very interested in popular music, and particularly in Broadway show music. And again, I really strongly recommend the book for the general question about formality, because I do think that the church's changes of musical habits are tied to its attitude toward formality and its acceptance of the preference for informality in our culture, which I don't think is, again, a morally neutral change. He says that most people listen to music because we're suspicious about form and don't pay attention to form. He says most people listen to music mainly for two things. They listen for the rhythm, a driving, and by the beat. That is, they don't listen for rhythmic complexity, something that moves from 3/4 time to 4/4 time, or something. They listen for something that has a kind of dominant, predictable mechanical rhythm. And secondly, they listen for the vernacular authenticity of the singer's vocal tone. Something that sounds natural and authentic and emotional. We want that. Melody and harmony are much less important than a regular danceable rhythm, and the vocal style has to be really unpolished. The singer should sound like somebody you could have a beer with, he says. Now, McWhorter compares a preference for such music with a preference for hot dogs and Coca-Cola. And here's what he says. Hot dogs are good, of course. Coke, I pity earlier Americans who did not have this exquisite tasting beverage. But in the end, hot dogs and Coke are simple stuff. Almost anyone likes them on first tasting worldwide. Asparagus is odd-looking and vaguely reminiscent of genitals. Oysters on the half shell look like mucus sitting in a pool of saliva on a rock. Bourbon doesn't really taste good at all and is more about smell and sensation. But these take more acclamation, but they are well worth the effort. Just, he says, as an earlier America had more room for bourbon, cocktail hour in those John Cheever homes, it had more room for music that takes an especially high degree of concentration to write, perform, and listen to. And here he's talking principally about popular music. I encourage you to read it, especially his discussion of Broadway music. One last observation, and we're going to listen to some music in the next lecture. I hike a lot on the Appalachian Trail, and I live just 20 minutes away from it. And I want you to imagine with me taking a walk in a place like that. And if you know nothing about the kinds of animals and plants that are present along the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains, if you know nothing about the history of the region or the landscape, you might enjoy the quality of the air and the vaguely perceived quality of color and sound. But if you're really knowledgeable about the surroundings, as I'm striving to be more so, the experience is remarkably different. If you could recognize the song of an indigo bunting and knew how high in the trees to look for it, how to move quietly enough to catch a glimpse of that iridescent blue, the experience of your body and your emotions on that hike would be a little different. If you stayed on the trail long enough, if you had the patience and vision to attend to subtle shifts in the quality of light or the texture of the breezes, then your eyes and skin would know something of the meaning of an autumn afternoon or a summer morning. If you knew the names and characteristics of indigenous wildflowers, you'd see more than just a vague prettiness at your feet. You'd see things at your feet that had a specific quality and a history evocative of healing, often. You'd see squirrel corn and great chickweed and witch hobble and virgin's bower, blazing star and sneezeweed, although you wouldn't see all of them on the same day because they don't all blossom in the same season. What I'm trying to say is that attentive experience helps to render experience intelligible and meaningful rather than just sensational. And a lot of our experience of music is mere sensation and not meaning. And I think we fall into the trap that Lewis warns about in Learning in Wartime, that we look for sensory pleasures and we abandon aesthetic pleasures. And that means that events that we can share about with others in detail, events that we can remember, describe, and possibly write about in some way. And that knowledge is acquired in many ways. It's acquired through apprenticeship and study and exploration and reflection. And I believe that it's a kind of knowledge that enables us to perceive the contours of reality better, and it can enable us, it doesn't guarantee it, it can enable us to conform our souls to reality. Because as I said a moment ago, the shape of reality is conferred by the Logos, who is love. So there's a deep relationship, I think, between attentiveness and to love. Becoming a musical person, being tuned, properly tempered correctly, I think may be a mode of love as well. We will stop there and we'll take some questions and come back in a little bit and we'll listen to a little bit of music finally.
I have a few leftover questions from last time, so I'm going to start with those. And if you have a question from this lecture, write it down and bring it up to me while I'm asking the leftovers. So first, can you recommend some books on the difference between hearing and seeing, especially as related to God's nature as non-imaged in the second commandment, but incarnated in Christ?
Yeah.
So hearing and seeing.
I can think of a couple offhand that touch on this. Walter Ong, who wrote a lot on language and orality, and I'm blanking on the title right now.
Presence of the Word.
Is it in the Presence of the Word?
The Presence of the Word, is that right?
Okay, yeah. There are a couple. That's definitely one of them. And another, and there's one. It may be orality and something. I think orality is in the title also. So Walter Ong and Jacques Ellul in what is it, the humiliation of the word. The humiliation of the word deals with some similar ideas. Now I don't endorse everything Ellul said by any means.
Nor do I.
No, yeah. But he does have some interesting ideas about seeing and hearing that do. Ong suggests that. It's kind of a difficult book, but Roger Scruton's book, The Aesthetics of Music, the first couple of chapters, he deals with the difference between hearing something and seeing something. And he starts off talking about sound and the nature of sound. And that's actually a pretty good, that gets into some of the things, not theologically necessarily, but it does. And Jeremy Begbie's Resounding Truth, again, he talks more about the uniqueness of sound, he does contrast it a little bit with image, with visual things.
Thank you. What if you think of music in terms of genre as we would literature? In other words, different rules apply to different genres, which complicate generic visions of music, just like the generic rules about literature can't account for the diverse genres in literature by one set of rules.
Yeah, sure, there would be, and not just between genres, but within a given genre, there would be the breaking of rules that occurs. But I think there are some things. I mean, what I'm basically saying that melody matters. Let me say something about melody. There are musical forms today which denigrate melody and harmony. To be a good hip-hop piece doesn't necessarily require subtle use of melodic or harmonic elements. So I want to evaluate that genre. I don't want to say the genre. I want to say that the genre is actually avoiding, as I would feel the same thing about atonal music or some. I think about serial music also. That is music that's. I know I'm getting technical here. Music that abandons conventional notions of harmony, which I think are rooted in physical reality. So I think here's a given across genres. If you have a melodic line in which you go up, da 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 da, you go up, you have to realize that has a sense of upness about it, that melodic structure. Harold Arlen would not have written the song, "Somewhere over the rainbow," somewhere. He's going up the scale. So he's writing a popular song. He's got to recognize that kind of motion, whether he's writing a piano sonata for chamber music, or he's writing a pop tune, or he's writing something for a Broadway musical, an ascending note suggests elevation, and descending notes suggest a kind of descent. We're going to hear an example of that next lecture. So I'd say there are things that work across genres. There are some things that work within specific genres, certainly, but they are still working with similar raw materials. Just as artists have to work with the properties of colors, they have to work with how blue relates to yellow, and they can't try to arbitrarily say, well, I want blue to relate to yellow a different way. It turns out that blue relates to yellow in some relatively predictable ways. So yeah, there are differences, but there are givens in the structure that need to be present. And we could take all of the elements. I haven't talked much about rhythm. We could also talk about rhythm.
So you said the same thing about literature. There'd be common elements across genres.
Right. Yes, exactly.
This is a question about sentimentality. This, again, is the last of the leftover ones from last time. You mentioned the sentimentality in an ironic revenge of nature robs us of expressing emotions. If emotions are best at home when connecting to creation, are they also an expression? How can some element of both objectivity and subjectivity be preserved? So I think the question has to do with, it's connecting with creation, it has some objective referent, but it's also an expression of the person. How do you keep those two together?
Well, let's talk about the expression of the person. Is this a well-trained and well-groomed person, or is this someone whose heart has not been well-trained? I think we tend to think that expressiveness in any artistic form, we tend to ascribe a kind of innocence and neutrality to the person who is expressing. And again, here we differ from what was assumed throughout history in every culture. That is that we don't allow children to grow up. That is, we try to train so that they will express certain things in certain ways, not in an entirely, cookie cutter way, some people may. I actually, my sister works with a woman who is just amazingly rude, and she often says, "Well, that's just the way I am." Well, that's not. We're not going to overlook this because this is your native tendency. That's the problem. So I'd say that expression. The other thing is we don't realize how much people think that their native expressiveness is something that just springs up from within without any kind of influence. They have been influenced from day one. They've been shaped, they've been formed by something. And whether they've been formed and shaped by good things is one thing. And of course, there are infinite varieties of difference, which is why, even in classical music, something, you're working with a given score, but performers will treat it differently. But they treat it differently within the context of what that score demands. So some people would express politeness or generosity, let's say, in different ways. But there are some things that just aren't generous. And so we'd want to say, or that the person may be intending to be generous, but actually it may be an expression of self-aggrandizement and not actually generous. And this is difficult with regard to things. A lot of people attach themselves to things like precious moments. and they say what's really meaningful to me, and I'm not questioning that it's meaningful, and I'm not saying that I'm not saying that their feelings are necessarily, I'm not saying that their feelings are necessarily bad. I think their feelings may be disproportionate. It may be meaningful in a way, it may be meaningful to a depth that obscures perception of other things, obscures perception of suffering, or obscures perception of some negative thing. Sentimentality, one definition I ran across years ago, it's loving something more than God does. So we ascribe a value to something and make it more valuable than it really is. And that, again, may be part of our personal expression, but that's actually part of a deformity in us that we ought to strive, and our teachers and elders ought to strive to help us remediate. And that, historically, that was what education was about. It was assumed that training someone so that they could be properly expressive, but not, again, in a cookie-cutter way.
Question about listening. What are the benefits and pitfalls of recorded as opposed to live music? How about the use of music as background? Do you wear your earbuds when you're hiking the Appalachian Trail?
I don't wear my earbuds when I'm hiking the Appalachian Trail, and I'll listen. I listen to background music sometimes. I choose it particularly, and I choose it to be music that usually is not music that demands much attention, because I find myself paying attention to it and not attending to the thing I should be doing. Like, I missed the exit on the interstate recently because I was listening to this really amazing cantata by Bach and I just totally swept right past it. We're not really as good at multitasking. In fact, there's some wonderful research. I encourage you to watch the Frontline documentary called Digital Nation, which looks at some of the recent research on multitasking. We really don't do two things at once very well. And we certainly can't listen to music music that requires a kind of attentiveness in the background. Recordings have a bane and a blessing. I mean, I'm very grateful for recordings. I make my life through recorded things. But I think that obviously it makes an amazing amount of repertoire available to us that wouldn't have been otherwise. The danger is that we regard that repertoire in such a hyper-personalized way and not something that's shared. And I think that music is communal, it should be communal, and not just virtual communal. I think that we should be in instances where music is shared more frequently. And unfortunately, recordings allow us to be so idiosyncratic that we don't share music. It's interesting to me that there are thousands and thousands of book groups in America where people get together to discuss literature. I don't know of many music groups where people get together to listen to music together. Now, part of it is because listening is different than talking about something. But recordings have enforced, and headphones have really reinforced it. Recordings have also reinforced our tendency, and this is something Julian Johnson deals with this in Who Needs Classical Music a little bit, our tendency to listen to short bursts of things. So we'll listen to 3 minutes of Beethoven's Ninth, or 4 minutes of Mahler, which you can never just listen to 4 minutes of Mahler. And so we listen to the little favorites, but we miss the whole context of the thing. Now, again, recordings give us the capacity to listen to it and to have repeated listening, which actually should make us into better listeners. But it's like with any other technology. It empowers us, but it also makes us into a quest. It gives us a quest for convenience, in which we don't submit to the thing that we should be submitting to.
Follow up to that. Can you describe how you decide what counts as background music for you?
Well, again, a lot of it would be just. And there's some music that I'll listen to foreground and background. I have some friends who cannot listen to background music at all because they're so too keyed into what's going on, even if it's not something that actually demands a lot. I mean, I'd say something that doesn't involve a lot of harmonic complexity, something that's not really dynamically demanding. I'll listen to some I like Celtic folk music a lot, and I'll listen to Celtic folk music in the background. It's funny, I've been doing less background listening since I've started thinking about these issues more. And not because I'm trying to be a purist, but I just found that I just am doing it less. And it's partly because I really want to hear what's going on more. And I know that like this poor character at the beginning of my talk who had been listening to this Vivaldi for years, hearing this Vivaldi, never listening to it. You know, maybe it's because I'm getting older and I want to make sure I've actually listened to it before I die. But maybe if it's good enough, I'll get to hear it later. So. So simple things that are more simple melodically and harmonically. That would be a principal rule.
One last one before we take a break. How do we listen to music without falling into the divided mindset of form, content, reason, imagination, when the music itself has been composed or produced along these divided
that's
lines?
a great question, and I think that that's why I think we need to listen to such music prophetically, if you will. I mean, you can listen to it, but then you have to realize this is encouraging a mentality in me that's not a good mentality. You know, all of us ought to be able to say, I remember years ago, Richard Newhouse, who I worked for a while, writing in a column saying something about somebody who said they liked something more than they knew they should. And I think that we ought to be aesthetically deliberate enough to be able to say, I like this more than I know I should like it. And I have this, you know, there's music that I like more than I should. There are films that I like more than I should. And again, it's not necessarily a moral failure on my part, but it is a kind of disciplinary failure where and that's everybody experiences that. George Steiner in Real Presences talks about an Edith Piaf recording that he knows is banal and horrible, but it just moves him, you know, so much. And he knows it shouldn't. But it's better to know that it shouldn't move you, although it may be a little more painful. But this is our tragic condition here. That rather than saying, well, I'm just going to go with what I like without questioning whether I like it more than I should.